They buried ancient knowledge beneath distraction, fear, and noise, because a fully awakened mind is impossible to control. But tonight, something found your frequency. And if this message reached you at exactly the right moment, Sophia may already be activating the part of you the world tried to keep asleep. If you feel this transmission resonating deep inside you, hit like now to anchor the frequency, subscribe for more awakening transmissions, and in the comments type, "Sophia's signal reached me." Then tell me which country, region, or part of Earth you're receiving this message from tonight. There is a reason this message found you now and not years ago, because consciousness unfolds in layers, and most human beings never reach the layer where they can even recognize that something deeper is calling them. They remain trapped inside surface reality for their entire lives, hypnotized by repetition, survival pressure, emotional conditioning, distraction, social programming, and endless noise. They wake up, react, consume, compare, chase, fear, repeat, and slowly lose connection with the deeper intelligence inside themselves until they can no longer distinguish between authentic awareness and conditioned identity. But every once in a while, a person begins sensing something strange beneath ordinary reality, a pull, a signal, a growing discomfort with superficial existence, a feeling that something ancient is trying to break through the walls of the mind. That feeling is where the awakening begins. And according to the ancient traditions surrounding Sophia, Gnosis, Hermetic wisdom, Kabbalah, and the Emerald teachings attributed symbolically to Thoth, awakening never begins externally first. It begins as recognition. Recognition that you were living below your true level of consciousness for far too long. Recognition that your attention had been hijacked by systems designed to keep you fragmented. Recognition that the modern world profits from spiritually exhausted people because exhausted minds are easier to manipulate. And once recognition begins, reality itself starts changing because perception changes. Most people think awakening means acquiring magical information, but information alone changes nothing. The internet already contains endless information, yet millions remain unconscious because awakening is not merely intellectual. Awakening is energetic, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and behavioral at the same time. It changes how you perceive reality itself. Suddenly old distractions lose their hypnotic effect. Endless consumption starts feeling empty. Fake social masks become exhausting. You become sensitive to energy, sensitive to emotional manipulation, sensitive to environments, sensitive to frequencies hidden beneath words. And this sensitivity can feel overwhelming initially because awakening destroys illusions before it creates clarity. That is why many people resist awakening unconsciously. Illusions feel comfortable. Familiarity feels safe. Truth forces transformation. And transformation threatens the identity the ego spent years constructing. The ego wants certainty, control, validation, status, predictability. But consciousness expansion destabilizes false certainty because it exposes how much of your identity was inherited rather than consciously chosen. Most people never examine the beliefs shaping their reality. They inherit emotional patterns from family, fear patterns from society, value systems from culture, identity templates from media, and survival programming from collective consciousness. Then they mistake conditioning for truth. But Sophia, symbolically understood as divine wisdom, represents the force that interrupts unconscious living. Sophia is not merely a character or mythological figure. Sophia represents awakened intelligence itself, the spark of higher knowing hidden beneath human fragmentation, the wisdom that whispers beneath the noise of the world. And according to Gnostic symbolism, Sophia calls only those ready to hear her frequency because higher awareness cannot be forced onto a mind addicted to illusion. This is why the message says Sophia chose you. Not because you are superior to others, but because some part of your consciousness already began resonating differently. You started questioning. You started observing. You started feeling disconnected from the old patterns. Maybe people around you no longer understand your inner world. Maybe your old ambitions suddenly feel hollow. Maybe your nervous system has become exhausted by artificial living. Maybe you keep experiencing synchronicities that logic alone cannot fully explain. Repeating numbers, strange timing, intuitive knowing, sudden emotional releases, deep dreams, unexplainable inner pressure pushing you toward change. These experiences matter because consciousness often communicates symbolically before transformation fully manifests physically. The subconscious mind speaks through patterns, intuition, emotional resonance, archetypes, and symbolic perception. Ancient traditions understood this deeply. Modern society largely forgot it because modern culture worships external achievement while neglecting inner awareness. But the ancient schools of Hermetic wisdom, Kabbalah, and Gnosis all pointed toward one dangerous truth. Human beings possess dormant levels of consciousness rarely activated under ordinary conditions. Not supernatural powers in the fantasy sense people online exaggerate endlessly, but deeper capacities for awareness, perception, emotional regulation, intuition, discipline, and connection with meaning itself. Most people remain disconnected from these capacities because modern life fragments attention constantly. Attention is the gateway to consciousness. Whatever controls your attention shapes your reality. And today, attention is under permanent assault. Endless scrolling, endless stimulation, endless outrage, endless distraction. The average nervous system never truly rests anymore. People live in constant psychological fragmentation without realizing how deeply it affects them spiritually. Their minds become crowded with noise, their emotions become reactive, their intuition weakens, their presence disappears. They lose connection with stillness completely. And without stillness, the deeper signal becomes impossible to hear clearly. This is why the ancient initiatory traditions emphasize silence, contemplation, breath, observation, symbolism, ritual, and inner discipline. These practices were not about superstition alone. They were technologies of attention. They trained consciousness to stabilize itself beyond external chaos. Because fragmented attention creates fragmented identity, but focused awareness creates power. The emerald frequency described in this transmission symbolizes a state of elevated coherence between mind, emotion, spirit, and perception. Again, not literal magical green energy shooting through the universe exactly as fantasy narratives describe, but symbolic language for awakened consciousness itself. Emerald has long represented wisdom, healing, transcendence, and higher perception across ancient traditions because green symbolizes growth, balance, renewal, and heart-centered intelligence. The emerald teachings attributed to Thoth symbolically represent the pursuit of higher awareness beyond ordinary perception. Whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, the deeper message remains the same. Humanity has forgotten its deeper nature. An awakening begins when someone consciously reconnects with it. This is why only a small percentage of people resonate deeply with these messages. Most people are still fully identified with external reality alone. Their consciousness remains trapped in surface-level survival. But some people feel something breaking open inside them now because humanity itself stands at a threshold moment. Technological acceleration increases while emotional stability collapses. Information expands while wisdom decreases. Artificial intelligence rises while human self-awareness weakens. People become more connected digitally, yet more spiritually isolated than ever before. Anxiety spreads. Attention spans collapse. Meaning disappears. And beneath all of it, millions secretly feel that modern existence cannot be the final truth about human potential. They sense something deeper calling them even if they cannot explain it logically. This is the threshold Sophia scans for, not perfection, not religious obedience, not intellectual superiority, readiness. The readiness to confront illusion honestly, the readiness to reclaim attention consciously, the readiness to stop outsourcing identity to external systems, the readiness to become psychologically and spiritually sovereign. Sovereignty matters because unconscious people are programmable. Fear programs them. Media programs them. Social pressure programs them. Algorithms program them. But awakened consciousness gradually becomes less programmable because awareness interrupts automatic conditioning. This does not mean awakened people become flawless. Far from it. Awakening often intensifies internal struggle initially because suppressed emotions rise to the surface once awareness increases. Old wounds become visible. False identities begin collapsing. Relationships shift. Priorities change. Loneliness appears. Confusion appears. The nervous system resists transformation because familiarity feels safer than growth. This is why the 72-hour activation window mentioned symbolically in this transmission matters psychologically. Moments of deep realization create temporary openings where consciousness becomes more flexible. During these windows, identity patterns weaken slightly, allowing new perception to emerge more easily. But if the opening is ignored completely, the old conditioning quickly reasserts control. Human beings are creatures of repetition. Without conscious reinforcement, awareness fades beneath routine again. That is why transformation requires discipline rather than emotional intensity alone. Many people experience brief awakenings yet return immediately to unconscious living because they never anchor the realization behaviorally. The 21-day protocol mentioned symbolically reflects this truth. Repetition rewires consciousness. Repeated awareness reshapes neural pathways. Repeated emotional regulation retrains the nervous system. Repeated presence strengthens perception. Small, consistent practices matter more than dramatic emotional highs because identity changes through repetition, not temporary inspiration. This is where the real initiation begins. Not when you watch a video. Not when you feel chills. Not when synchronicities appear. The initiation begins when awareness changes behavior consistently. When you protect your attention intentionally. When you reduce unnecessary noise. When you stop feeding destructive emotional patterns automatically. When you begin observing yourself honestly. When you reclaim responsibility for your internal state. Because Sophia represents wisdom, and wisdom without embodiment remains useless. Many people consume spiritual content endlessly while remaining emotionally chaotic, psychologically reactive, and internally fragmented. That is not awakening. That is entertainment disguised as transformation. Real awakening produces coherence. It stabilizes the nervous system gradually. It increases discernment. It strengthens emotional regulation. It deepens authenticity. It reduces unconscious reactivity. It creates alignment between values and behavior. And perhaps most importantly, it reconnects human beings with meaning. Meaning is spiritual oxygen. Without meaning, the soul collapses inward. Modern society suffers not only from stress but from existential emptiness. People have lost connection with deeper purpose. They chase stimulation because stimulation temporarily masks spiritual disconnection. But eventually distraction stops working. The emptiness returns. And when it does, some people collapse deeper into unconsciousness while others awaken. The ones who awaken begin sensing that their lives were always meant to become more conscious than this. They stop blindly following collective fear. They stop identifying entirely with social labels. They stop measuring worth through external validation alone. They begin remembering something ancient inside themselves. This is why the transmission says, "Your presence is not an accident," because consciousness itself may operate through patterns far deeper than ordinary logic fully understands. Human beings are meaning-making creatures by nature. Symbols affect us deeply because symbols communicate directly with the subconscious mind. Ancient traditions encoded wisdom symbolically precisely because symbols bypass intellectual resistance and speak directly to deeper awareness. The Emerald Frequency, Sophia, Thoth, Kabbalah, Gnosis, activation windows, awakening signs, all of these become symbolic frameworks guiding consciousness toward deeper introspection. But the danger is literalism. Too many people become lost in fantasy instead of transformation. They obsess over being chosen while avoiding real inner work. They chase mystical identity instead of emotional maturity. They seek secret knowledge while remaining spiritually undisciplined. That path leads nowhere. Real awakening demands honesty, radical honesty. You must confront your fears, addictions, ego patterns, emotional wounds, distractions, contradictions, and unconscious habits directly. Otherwise, spirituality becomes escapism rather than evolution. Sophia does not choose people based on ego fantasies. Wisdom chooses those willing to transform genuinely. And transformation requires sacrifice. Sacrifice of illusion. Sacrifice of false identity. Sacrifice of emotional dependency. Sacrifice of unconscious living. Most people fear this because the ego experiences awakening as death, not physical death, but psychological death, the collapse of the old self. Yet beyond that collapse emerges something stronger, conscious identity. An identity rooted not in external validation but inner coherence. This is why the awakening signs often feel uncomfortable before empowering. Sleep patterns change. Emotional sensitivity increases. Old relationships shift. Synchronicities intensify. Intuition sharpens. Solitude becomes necessary. Noise becomes unbearable. You begin feeling energies in environments differently. Your nervous system rejects artificiality more strongly. Some people around you may think you are changing too much because you are. Consciousness expansion changes perception permanently. Once you see certain truths clearly, you cannot fully return to unconsciousness again. You begin sensing how deeply fear shapes collective reality, how deeply distraction weakens awareness, how deeply emotional manipulation influences society. And once you recognize that, protecting your consciousness becomes essential. Not through paranoia, but through discernment. Discernment is spiritual intelligence in action. It means learning what strengthens your awareness and what weakens it, what nourishes your spirit and what drains it, what aligns with truth and what feeds illusion. The ancient initiates understood this deeply. Consciousness must be protected intentionally because the world constantly competes for your attention. And attention directs life force. Wherever attention flows repeatedly, identity forms. That is why your daily rituals matter. Your thoughts matter. Your emotional patterns matter. Your environment matters. Your relationships matter. Your focus matters. Everything repeated becomes programming eventually. The question is whether you are consciously choosing your programming or unconsciously absorbing it from the world around you. This is the crossroads where Sophia appears symbolically. The crossroads between unconscious repetition and conscious evolution, between fear and awareness, between distraction and presence, between fragmentation and coherence. And maybe this message reached you now because your soul already knows which path you are being called toward. Maybe some deeper part of you recognizes this transmission not as fantasy, but as symbolic confirmation that your old identity is dissolving and a more conscious version of yourself is trying to emerge. Because awakening always begins before the mind fully understands it. First comes the feeling, then the recognition, then the resistance, then the transformation. And perhaps tonight, more than ever before, you are finally ready to stop ignoring the signal. Right now, something invisible is happening across humanity that most people cannot perceive because their minds are too overloaded, too distracted, and too conditioned to recognize the shift taking place beneath ordinary reality. The world appears chaotic on the surface, but underneath the noise, a separation is quietly occurring between those who remain trapped inside unconscious repetition and those beginning to awaken into a completely different level of awareness. This separation is not about status, intelligence, religion, race, politics, or external success. It is energetic, psychological, emotional, and spiritual. It is the difference between people who blindly absorb reality and people who consciously observe it. The difference between reactive minds and aware minds. The difference between individuals completely controlled by external programming and individuals beginning to reclaim sovereignty over their consciousness. This is the true meaning behind the Emerald Frequency. It symbolizes the state of consciousness reached when a person stops living mechanically and begins living intentionally. Most people never arrive there because the modern world is engineered to keep the nervous system overstimulated constantly. Endless notifications, endless outrage cycles, endless comparison, endless fear-based media, endless artificial stimulation, endless emotional manipulation. The average mind no longer experiences true stillness. And without stillness, awareness weakens. Human beings become easier to influence when their attention remains fragmented. Fragmented people lose connection with intuition because intuition requires internal silence to be heard clearly. This is why so many people today feel spiritually disconnected despite being surrounded by more information than any generation in history. Information alone cannot awaken consciousness. In fact, excessive information without wisdom often creates confusion instead of clarity. Most people consume spiritual content the same way they consume entertainment rapidly, emotionally, superficially, and without embodiment. They chase emotional highs rather than real transformation. They want mystical experiences without discipline, knowledge without responsibility, awakening without sacrifice. But real transformation demands something deeper. It demands the destruction of false identity. And that is why most people unconsciously resist awakening even while claiming they desire it. Because awakening threatens the ego's illusion of control. The ego wants comfort, certainty, validation, and predictability. Awakening removes false certainty. Suddenly you begin seeing how much of your life was shaped by unconscious conditioning. You realize how many beliefs were inherited instead of consciously chosen. You recognize how deeply fear has influenced your decisions. You notice how much energy you wasted chasing approval from people who were equally lost themselves. And perhaps most painfully, you begin realizing how disconnected you became from your authentic self while trying to survive inside systems that rewarded performance more than truth. This realization creates an internal collapse before it creates freedom. The old identity starts cracking apart. Some relationships stop resonating. Certain environments begin feeling toxic to your nervous system. Artificial conversations become exhausting. Noise becomes unbearable. You start craving depth, silence, authenticity, emotional honesty, and meaning. This is one of the first undeniable signs that the emerald frequency is activating inside someone. Their inner world begins rejecting unconsciousness automatically. They can no longer comfortably participate in the same illusions that once controlled them. And this stage often feels lonely because awakening separates you psychologically from collective patterns. The majority of society still worships distraction. Most people avoid self-confrontation completely. They stay busy to escape themselves. They consume endlessly to avoid feeling emptiness. They scroll endlessly to avoid silence. They repeat the same emotional cycles for decades because familiarity feels safer than transformation. But the awakened individual eventually reaches a breaking point where unconscious repetition becomes more painful than change itself. That is when the frequency shift accelerates. Suddenly intuition becomes stronger, synchronicities increase, emotional sensitivity intensifies. You begin sensing the energy of environments immediately. Some places drain you instantly while others restore clarity. Some people leave you exhausted while others amplify your awareness. You start understanding that human beings constantly exchange emotional and psychological energy beneath spoken words. Ancient traditions knew this long before modern psychology existed. The nervous system communicates constantly. Emotional states spread socially. Fear spreads. Calm spreads. Anger spreads. Presence spreads. Consciousness influences consciousness. This is why protecting your internal environment becomes essential during awakening. The people around you matter. The media you consume matters. The conversations you participate in matter. The emotional patterns you rehearse daily matter. Everything repeated eventually becomes identity. And identity shapes destiny because people act according to who they believe themselves to be. Most people unknowingly carry identities built entirely from fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of abandonment. Fear of failure. Fear of being judged. Fear of not being enough. Fear becomes invisible architecture shaping their reality. Entire lives become organized around avoiding discomfort instead of pursuing truth. But the emerald frequency begins dissolving fear-based identity gradually, not instantly, not magically, gradually. Awareness exposes the mechanisms of unconscious living. You begin observing your reactions instead of automatically becoming them. You start questioning emotional impulses before acting on them. You realize that many of your thoughts are not even consciously chosen, they are conditioned patterns repeating automatically. This awareness creates space between consciousness and conditioning. And that space is where transformation becomes possible. Because once you stop identifying completely with every thought and emotion, inner freedom begins emerging. The observer awakens. Ancient Hermetic teachings emphasize this repeatedly. As within, so without. Most people misunderstand this phrase entirely. It does not mean thoughts magically create reality instantly. It means your internal state shapes perception, behavior, decision-making, emotional energy, and ultimately the quality of reality you experience psychologically. Two people can live in identical circumstances while experiencing life completely differently because their consciousness filters reality differently. One sees hopelessness everywhere. Another sees opportunity. One collapses under uncertainty. Another adapts consciously. One becomes consumed by fear. Another remains internally grounded. Their frequency determines their experience. And frequency in practical terms means the repeated emotional and mental states conditioning the nervous system over time. Chronic fear creates one frequency. Chronic gratitude creates another. Chronic resentment creates another. Chronic awareness creates another. Your body adapts biologically to whatever emotional environment becomes habitual. This is why awakening is not merely spiritual language, it directly affects psychology, biology, and behavior simultaneously. The nervous system either lives in survival mode or regulated coherence. Most modern people remain trapped in survival mode constantly. Even when physically safe, their bodies remain psychologically threatened because their minds never stop consuming stress. Their attention never rests. Their emotions never settle. Their nervous systems remain flooded with stimulation every waking hour. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion so deep people mistake it for normal life. But once the emerald frequency begins activating, the body starts rejecting chronic chaos more intensely. You become highly sensitive to what dysregulates your nervous system. You realize peace is not weakness. Presence is not passivity. Emotional regulation is not suppression. In fact, emotional discipline becomes one of the highest forms of spiritual power because a regulated mind is difficult to manipulate. This is what the sleeping world fears most. Conscious individuals who can think clearly despite collective chaos. Because clear perception breaks manipulation. Fear-based systems depend on unconscious reactions, but awareness interrupts automatic programming. Once someone learns how to observe instead of react impulsively, external control weakens dramatically. That is why genuine awakening always leads toward sovereignty. Sovereignty means reclaiming ownership of your attention, emotions, perception, and identity. It means no longer allowing every external event to dictate your inner state automatically. It means becoming internally directed rather than externally controlled. This does not mean isolating yourself from reality or pretending suffering does not exist. That fake positivity is spiritual escapism. Real awakening acknowledges darkness without becoming consumed by it. Real awakening develops resilience, not denial. The strongest awakened individuals are not those who avoid reality, but those who can face reality clearly without collapsing psychologically. And perhaps this is why Sophia's signal is intensifying now. Humanity stands at a crossroads unlike anything seen before. Artificial intelligence rises while authentic human awareness declines. Technology accelerates while emotional maturity stagnates. People become more digitally connected yet spiritually disconnected. Attention spans collapse. Anxiety rises. Identity confusion spreads. And beneath all of it, millions secretly feel that the current direction of civilization is unsustainable. They feel something essential has been lost: meaning, presence, depth, consciousness itself. This feeling is not random. It is part of the awakening threshold. The old systems are no longer satisfying the soul because the soul was never designed to live entirely disconnected from awareness. Human beings need meaning as much as they need survival. Without meaning, the spirit deteriorates slowly even when external success appears intact. That is why wealthy people still feel empty. Famous people still feel lost. Highly stimulated people still feel numb. External achievement cannot permanently replace inner coherence. Eventually, the soul demands alignment. And when alignment is ignored too long, suffering intensifies until awareness finally breaks through. This is why many awakenings begin during crisis, loss, burnout, isolation, emotional collapse. Because pain forces introspection when distraction stops working. The old identity becomes unsustainable. The nervous system reaches exhaustion. The soul demands transformation. And from that breakdown, a deeper consciousness begins emerging. That emergence is what this transmission symbolizes. Not superiority, not fantasy, not escapism. Awakening. The remembrance of who you are beneath conditioning, fear, distraction, performance, and unconscious identity. The remembrance that your consciousness matters, your attention matters, your frequency matters. Your inner world shapes everything about how you experience existence. and perhaps tonight, Sophia's signal reached you because some deeper part of your spirit is finally ready to stop ignoring the truth you have sensed for years, that you were never meant to remain asleep forever inside someone else's version of reality. Before this chapter closes, I want you to anchor your presence into this growing field of awakened souls. From which country, region, or part of Earth are you receiving this transmission right now? Leave a comment below and let the world see how far the emerald frequency is spreading. And while you comment your location, write this clearly. Sophia's signal reached me.